up here joining me today, we have the absolutely wonderful Dr. Kath White, OBE. Do I have to say OBE every time I refer to you, Dr. White?
Yes. Yeah.
Right, got it. So, Dr. White, OBE, is a forensic physician. She's a specialist in the treatment of sexual assault and rape victims and is an ex-clinical director of St Mary's Sexual Health Referral Centre. Kath sits on a group of expert volunteers who are working together to raise awareness and organise training for professionals so they fully understand the new offence of non-fatal strangulation. We're going to hear from Kath a little bit more directly about that in a moment. I'm also joined by the wonderful Zach. Zach? But you know what? Do you know what I mean? Like, you know, it's all good. Like, because it's fine. You won't be offended. You won't be offended. Zach possibly needs no introduction for some of the people in the room here. Zach's been an adult content creator for the last 2 years using platforms like OnlyFans, Just for Fans, and Pornhub, and has previous experience as an escort. Do you mind me talking about some of the things from your bio, Zach? Is that all right? So Zach also battled addiction to crystal meth for over 10 years. And spent a short time in prison. He discovered adult content creation 2.5 years ago. And Zach is also living with HIV. And finally, we have Dr. Yes! I forgot, it's drag rules, isn't it? So every time like I finish a statement, what I'm supposed to do is end the sentence with like a kind of raise, but it felt weird saying, Zach lives with HIV! But maybe that's part of the problem, right? That actually we shouldn't have a problem with raising the sentence at the end there, so I do apologise, Zach. And finally we have Dr. Andrew Tompkins, who is a consultant in HIV and sexual health. Andrew works as an NHS consultant, still there in the old NHS, thank heavens, specifically in sexual health and HIV medicine. And you get about a bit as well, don't you, Andrew? And you've worked in clinics all over Manchester, in various hospital settings. And he has experience in reviewing patients presenting to services, specifically following both acute and recent sexual assault. So please a round of applause for my amazing panel of guests. How do you start a discussion about sex? And I think that actually is going to be my first question, because all of you in various ways are used to having complex conversations about sex. How do we start conversations about sex?
Well, I could start, but first of all I think we should say you're looking particularly fabulous. Put everyone to shame, Cheddar.
No shame here.
I guess working in sexual health, we're pretty fortunate that the name is above the door. People are coming in generally expecting to be asked personal questions. But in saying that, we have people come in, you can see them sort of shaking, as you call them, from the waiting room, and they don't know what to expect. So I guess you have to just take it person by person, individually, and just gently, you know, approach the subject of how can we help you in a sexual health setting, and gradually just let that person lead the way, really, and open up as they go through. And sort of, in sexual health, we tend to give little bits of warning shots that we're going to ask a few more personal questions as we go through, so that that person knows that more sensitive questions are coming. We would certainly say, when was the last time you had sexual contact, and take it from there. Really.
So you stay on the practical things. Is there still a trouble speaking about sex? I suppose for all of you in your various kind of fields, do people still struggle with this? Because they're having a lot of sex.
I think I have quite a... Good morning, everyone, I should say. I have quite a distorted view, because for the last 30-odd years, I've worked in sexual assault, violence, so I was once described as a sex expert, and my husband of 40 years, you know, this is a trade description going on here.
Was that a read from your husband?
So I have a very distorted view of sex, because the people I'm seeing, that I'm talking to, don't want to be in front of me. You know, this is because something bad has happened to them, and the conversations that I have are probably very different a lot of the time from other conversations. So I don't know whether that answers the question.
It's an added layer of sensitivity, I'm guessing. So you have sex on one level that's really difficult to talk about, but then also sexual violence is this entire other thing. Why do you think it is such a struggle to talk about sexual violence as opposed to talking about other forms of violence which might be easier to deal with?
Well, I think, you started off the morning talking about shame, and there's often layers and layers of shame. People, I often see them hours afterwards. The Sonaga case, I watched hours and hours and hours of video footage, all those cases. I was the medical expert in the 3 trials. People often blame themselves for the situation that they've found themselves in, usually wrongly, but they're trying to make sense of what's happened. And you can't control other people, but you can kind of control yourself. So I think very quickly they think, if I hadn't have done this, if I hadn't have done that, if I hadn't got drunk. And part of the thing you have to ask about is drugs and alcohol. And I'll always say, Friday nights were made to go out and have fun and drink. And not just Friday nights, but you're trying to straight away give them, don't be harsh on yourself, don't be blaming yourself. You should have been out, you should have been having fun. So I don't know whether they take any notice of me, but I'm trying to drop little nuggets in there that afterwards they reflect and think, yeah, it wasn't my fault.
Shame is a big thing that I feel runs throughout, particularly for queer people, shame around sex. Zach, in your world, what is it like speaking about sex? Is it different? Because obviously I imagine in the world of adult entertainment, the emphasis on pleasure, desire, some of the more positive aspects of sex, is there still a struggle in talking about sex, and how do you manage that?
I mean, for me, sex is, I have 2 sides of it. I have the business side, and I have my personal enjoyment, and I have to quite separate the two. And within the business side, I've got clients as an escort who are coming to me, and many of them are filled with shame. They're still trying to figure out who they are. They're coming to me because they want to experiment. They're coming to me because they're married, or they come from a certain community that is not accepting of who they are, and they couldn't possibly explore, they struggle to explore. And I'm dealing with that. And then the other side, as content creators, we're meeting people who absolutely know what they want, absolutely know who their audience is, absolutely know what their niche is and what they want out of the session. And then my own personal sex life, where I get to enjoy the passion and the connection and all of those wonderful things about sex, which we don't always get to do when we're creating content. People think content, you're going to have great sex all the time. And don't get me wrong, I do. But also, that 20-minute scene that you're watching probably took an hour to film, and it was stop here, start here, and move over there, move over there. The fun and the passion gets removed from it, so it's difficult. But there is a lot of shame, and there's a lot of shame attached to being a sex worker, and oldest trade in the world. It's great fun, but it's very difficult for people to feel comfortable enough to just express themselves for fear of judgment. And I think it's something that plagues gay men generally. I think I remember when I was a teenage boy and in my early 20s, having sex and immediately being absolutely overwhelmed with shame and guilt just for having sex and enjoying myself. And I think that plagues many of us in our early years.
I feel like OnlyFans and similar content, there are other content creation platforms available, obviously, you know, because I'm contracted by the BBC, so I have to mention NDA, no, not really. They often get quite a bad rep. Like, and in the press, they're kind of talked about as in a kind of scandalous way, and oh, she's on OnlyFans now. Do you think there is a different role, or what role do you think these platforms and people like yourself have to play in maybe dispelling that stigma and shame that's around sex?
When I was a teenage boy, I found my father's porn stash, and I actually wanted to become a porn star from being a teenage boy, but that was back in the 90s. Maybe just figure it out. And the porn industry was very, very different. And when I decided that I wanted to start doing content creation, I said to myself, well, this is your last sort of chance. You know, I'm in 40s, and but what I found that OnlyFans has done, specifically more OnlyFans, is it has allowed anyone and everyone to make content, explore all their sexuality and all the wonderful things that we get to enjoy, and find their audience, and show that anyone and everyone can do this and can be free to explore their sexuality with other people and show other people that it is possible. I think there's absolutely a place for it, and I've found the porn industry or the adult industry has a bad reputation, but what I have found is I have found my family, I have found my friends, I have found safety. I am far more adventurous than I ever was before doing content. I thought I'd be a bit mediocre, and then I started doing content and experiencing different things that you do because, oh well, the audience like this, so we'll give it a go, and you put on the show, and actually you find yourself enjoying something you never even realised you enjoyed. And it's done safely with full consent and around people that are enjoying something.
Do you contract, and this is very practical, I'm going to move off from you in a second, but like, do you find that you have to contract those things? Because obviously we don't talk a lot in our personal sexual relationships. At least it is a convention to not necessarily explicitly talk about everything as it's happening, which perhaps maybe is something we can learn from the adult entertainment industry. Do you have to contract those relationships, and to what extent?
I mean, we have consent forms, and that's more to do with how we utilise that content. But absolutely, in any conversation building up to that scene and before that scene, it's what are the boundaries? What are we doing? What are we not doing? What is allowed to happen? Because undoubtedly, in the scene, we're going to get carried away, we're in the passion, we're in the moment, we're going to do something because we feel the urge to, and we're going to go for it. And that person might not be, might not experienced it before, might be a bit taken aback, it might disrupt things, and it's about reading that person, having that clear understanding that they can stop and say no, they can move it around anything they like. So whilst we don't contract the specific activity, there is a full and frank open discussion at the beginning about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, where can I go, what can I not do. And that's working with gay men. I work a lot with straight men, you know, what we call the gay haters, as it were, and they've got really strict boundaries. You know, don't touch this, don't touch that, don't do this, don't. That's even, you know, there's really more strict rules there, and that's about respecting each other's desires, wishes, and not wanting to disrupt the flow of that scene.
So switching a little bit on tack, but actually kind of linked into that idea of how you safely explore fantasy, I suppose. I think it would be really interesting to hear from you, Dr. Cathode. Obviously, your speciality is in strangulation, and I think it would actually. I'd like to just learn a little bit more about how that works, because it's not something I'm into, as it were, not something I've actually necessarily explored. So what kind of happens? What kind of practices are we talking about?
I never used the OBE because I did it once. I was giving a presentation in America, and so they had my name up, and I was waiting to speak, and I was listening to someone behind me. They were like, "Dr. Catherine White Obbie." I wonder whether she's Nigerian. So after that, never bothered. But, so I think the whole thing about consent and strangulation is it's got, well, any consent has got to be informed consent, hasn't it? There's no point just saying, "Can I strangle you?" Yeah, of course you can. You've got to know what the issues are. And I might be unpopular here, but I did lobby the government to make changes to the pornography rules for not depicting strangulation in pornography. So that might make me unpopular. I am a libertarian. I do believe that you should be in charge of your own body and what you're doing, but as long as you know what the risks are. And the thing with strangulation is there's a lot of misconceptions. A lot of people think, protect the windpipe. If you protect the windpipe, you're okay. But actually, the worst thing you can do is press on either side of the windpipe. And how long does it take to lose consciousness with strangulation? Any starters?
3 seconds.
3 seconds, that would be quite fast. Probably, I don't know what you're doing, but...
Maybe you just, were having too good a time. Things concluded before then.
So in research where they did protect the windpipe, it was 6.8 seconds on average. But consciousness isn't like a light switch. You start to get confused in the seconds leading up to it. And the whole thing, what organs you need for consent, it's your brain, isn't it? And the issue with strangulation is the organ that you need to maintain consent and be able to communicate what you want and what you don't want is the organ that you are now switching off. And so that's where the dangerousness lies with strangulation. So yeah, do it if people can sort of play acts that they are strangling. But if you are actually being strangled or doing the strangling, then you could potentially, lead into dangerous territory. And that head rush that people enjoy with strangulation is actually brain cells dying. Now, I do a lot of daft things. I do things that are dangerous. I know it doesn't look like it, but I do. And so I don't want to tell people what they should and shouldn't be doing, but I think that people need the information so they can decide for themselves what they're doing. And the thing is, you cannot, in the law, consent to something that does you serious harm. And there was a court case, wasn't there, just 2 weeks ago, about that very thing.
It makes me think about kink scenes, actually. So I remember when I was growing up in the 18th century or 19th century, it was one of the two. I spent a long time growing up. But I remember that the way kink scenes worked was very different, actually, to how I feel people get involved with kink today. Whereas a lot of the time I feel people's roots through to kink now come in through social media, they come in through making connections, they come to going to a night even. Whereas I feel like the kink scene used to be a little bit more closed doors, and within the kink scene there used to be quite stringent education almost. So you would have kind of dons that were particularly well known. I didn't know them personally, obviously. But you had dons that were known for their expertise, and that was the appeal, was that they were educated, they knew how a person's body worked, they knew the kind of the sciences around it. But do you think there is a space for that kind of training? Or do you feel that there are certain things, as you say, there's a legal difficulty there? Are there certain things that it's just impossible to say? And there's a lot of professionals in the room here. There are certain things that it is harder to advocate for harm reduction around. That's a difficult question, I know, and I'm not trying to make you unpopular, I just think it's important to have it.
I can do that myself. Yeah, I was thinking about the harm reduction because we had, like I said, I came into this, so we've set up the Institute for Addressing Strangulation, came into it very much sexual violence, but then very quickly got into conversations of the BDSM community, where, don't call us a victim, we're not victims, this is what we're doing kind of thing. And harm reduction, I struggle with it, and I don't know whether, because it's a bit like, if you're going to drink drive, do it safely, do it on a road where there's not too many pedestrians. I don't know, I do struggle with the harm reduction, but I don't know whether I need to get over that, and, it's difficult. I suppose harm reduction would be, if you are going to do this, don't do it when you're under the influence of anything else, because it's going to compound. Does that happen in real life? I don't know.
I think it's weird because we as, and particularly around sex, and I think this is going to come up, it's a really interesting theme, I think, to identify, because I often talk about how I feel as queer people, we don't like being told what to do we? We don't like the idea that somebody's going to get in the way of our freedom. How very dare they? And that comes from a long history of the fact that, particularly around sex, rules around sex have been used unnecessarily and unfairly to throw prejudice at our community, to limit our freedom, to tell us that we're shameful and wrong and we're going to go to hell. Right? Like, that's what it comes down to. So I often think that queer people, particularly, have a bit of a struggle when it comes to the idea of balancing our freedom with our own well-being and the well-being of our community. And it's a really tense discussion. Does anybody want to come back in on that? Because I feel that, Zach, do you have anything to say? So you were nodding along to that, and I feel like there might be something you want to say. Or to what Kath has said, because I think it's so important to have this conversation.
I mean, Kath and I briefly had a conversation earlier because, as I would call it, breath play is one of my personal favourite kinks, and something that I've explored on and off camera. Not so much on camera anymore. And interestingly enough, I released a very big scene of it at the day that the government announced that they didn't want to have it in pornography anymore. So that was an excellent marketing tool for me. I've been very fortunate that I've experienced it with very capable, very experienced people showing me what to do. And I think when I did my first proper scene of breath play, I did pass out, but I was with someone who knew what they were doing. And that is the danger, of course, is taking it too far. And I think there is absolutely a place for some kind of education. People are going to do it. People are going to do it. And in the queer community, we love to push the boundaries in every way, shape or form. And I think if we can educate people on, if you are going to do this, this is the most appropriate way of doing it, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to look out for. After all that, we have agreed to do this, and you're not going to do this when you're high and drunk or whatever else. I think there's absolutely a place for it, and there's absolutely a place for educating people on, if it does go wrong, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to, how you're going to care for that person if they do pass out very briefly, and it can be very briefly, what are you going to do, how are you going to help them? All of those things, I think, will help reduce harm in the long term.
Andrew, I want to come back to you, because obviously we've already, in just these few minutes of talking about sex, I mean obviously some very specific areas of sex, we have identified it's a complex thing, and I imagine brings up a lot of different concerns, particularly around rape, sexual assault, but also more generally around sexual health. How is the NHS geared for dealing with the complexity of the discussions around sex, and how standardised is that around the service? Be as brutally honest as you like. Are there any NHS bosses in the room? No, good.
Let's not get too political. I guess sexual health is so important. It's a pillar of our well-being. It's a form of connection, and for many people, it's a really important part of life. And unfortunately, the funding for sexual health doesn't follow that ethos. ethos, really. So we in sexual health do the very best that we can with the resources that we've got, but we all are under no illusion that we're not meeting the demands placed on the service. And that's what's fantastic about organisations like We Are Survivors and George House Trust, that we work in partnership with other organisations where the NHS is maybe not able to meet the full holistic needs of the person. So yeah, I think it's a case of we're all trying, we all really want to support people to have fantastic, healthy, empowered sex lives, and we will do our very best to do that. But yeah, there are time and money constraints.
Do you think there are better areas to present these issues than others? Like saying, for example, like a city like Manchester.
Yeah.
Is there going to be a little bit of a? I mean, obviously we have certain centralised services when it comes to sexual violence, but like for presenting, is there a problem that some areas are just completely?
Yeah, I think we are fortunate in the city centre in Salford and Urmston that the services are all run in the NHS. It's the outer areas in Greater Manchester that can sometimes struggle with more funding. And in an ideal world, we'd all be working as one big family, one big service, and that's something that we, would love the future to look like, really. So yeah.
Zach, going back to, you made a brief point then earlier about the role of people in your community. And I wondered how the community navigates boundaries in terms of personal boundaries, but also kind of wider ethical boundaries. Are there conversations like that within the community about harm reduction, about things coming in like the strangulation bill? Is there a broader discussion in communities like content creators?
I think there's yes, to a certain extent. I think it's certainly, I found within content creation you have the newbies and you have the elders, if you like, and the elders try their best to show new people coming into the industry the way forward in terms of consent, in terms of sexual health, in terms of not doing things that you're absolutely not comfortable with, because, as I said, people will do things in order to please their audience and might find themselves doing something that they didn't really want to or are not comfortable with. And we try to encourage everybody to set your boundaries really clear at the beginning. This is what you want to do, this is not what you want to do. And don't only push those if you're really comfortable to do so, and if you're willing to not just because to please either your scene partner or your audience. I think there's absolutely more work to be done, and I think there's also there's a place for the more established, well-known creators to be part of that campaigning process outside of the industry and in the wider community. And I think people may well sit around and listen a little bit more because they can associate and relate with that person, and they have a bit of a platform, and I think there's definitely a place for it.
Before we go into kind of like, because you have to finish with like a really cool dramatic question, don't you, that everybody responds to. That's how these panels work. It's not that I haven't thought of that question yet, but I thought it might actually just be interesting to throw it open to the room if anybody's got any questions, and I'll run around like Ricky Lake. That was me. Is there anybody who has any questions? And I'll come in. Oh, they're over there.
So what would harm reduction actually look like when we're looking at non-fatal strangulation?
Thanks. I think one of the things is calling it what it is, which is strangulation. I do have a problem with the term breath play because it's not about breath. Have any of you seen the film The Deepest Breath? The free diver? Yeah. I mean, I think the world record for holding your breath underwater is 29 minutes. You would be dead if that was, so call it strangulation. And I think the other thing is about harm reduction. Again, it's all about information, isn't it? It's about giving people the right information so they can make the right choice for them, not for anybody else. But one of the things, research is not just about the immediacy, about whether you're going to lose consciousness or not, and whether you're going to start breathing again or not. In research where they've put people in functional MRI scanners when they've consensually been strangled several times, the brain has to work harder than the people who've never been strangled. Because your brain doesn't know whether it's consensual or not. It's a bit like me smoking cigarettes for 20 years and then telling my lungs, you can't get lung cancer because it was consensual. Your brain doesn't know that, and your lungs don't know that. So I think it's about giving people the right information so they can make the right choices for themselves. And unfortunately, it's moved way out of kink and everything like that, as Cheddar said, and now it's mainstream. And you've got little kids singing Jack Harlow lyrics who don't even really understand what they're talking about, and that's, I don't know if that answers your question.
Was there anyone else who wanted to respond to that? I think what's quite interesting for me is that, and I think you make the cigarette comparison, and I think that's fascinating because obviously there is no way to smoke cigarettes in a way that would be good harm reduction capacity, right? But as a society, we haven't banned it. We haven't banned the visual representation of it. And that's not me taking a moral side either way, right? Because I ain't a smoker and I don't like it, right? I don't have it in my house and that's how I think about it, but that's my house. But at the same time, we don't ban the visual depiction of smoking. We frame it in a particular way, absolutely. Yet, when it comes to anything to do with sex, which can't be harm reduced, this is where that sensitivity around sex that comes in, which I think is really interesting in our society. And I'm not making a comparison, I'm not a scientist, I can't tell you which one's worse for your brain. Look at Google.
Thank you. I work as a psychotherapist here in Manchester, so I work a lot with sex, sexuality, identity, and sexual abuse. I'm really interested in the idea of what does non-verbal consent look like, and how we're actually educating about what consent is for young people to have a voice and that sense of identity to be able to speak up in the moment. What are your takes on that?
I think it all comes down to communication from the get-go with young people, with any people engaging in sex, and it's clear that in the moment, if someone has previously had sexual harm, there's the potential for them to go into freeze rather than be able to sort of verbalise, yeah, I don't want to go there, I don't want to do this. So it's really tough, but I think it comes down to really good communication with those having sex beforehand and saying, these are my boundaries. If I freeze up, please stop. Or if I pull away, if I withdraw away from you, I don't want to go there. And given the people the agency to be able to have that conversation beforehand. So it comes down to really good education and upskilling people to be able to communicate.
I think what I like to say is consent is really sexy. And for me, especially in some of the work that I do, when we set all those boundaries at the beginning and we're all getting in the moment, and I like nothing more than checking in with the person I'm with. And this happens in my private life as well, just checking in and just, it is about communication, it's looking at each other, and it's remembering that I think sometimes sex can become so transactional, but it's remembering that this is a really intimate moment and you need to be able to let your guard down and inhibitions down, and you need to communicate with your eyes and with your body, and not be afraid to say no, not be afraid to check in that person, just hey, are you doing all right, everything going, are you happy? And all of those things I just think makes the experience fantastic. And so, yeah, just keep checking in and just be in that person's space and just, look in their eyes and really look at them, not just think of them as objects, and look at them deeply.
I don't want to jump on the consent is sex, because the consent panel, we're actually having an entire panel about it, which has always struck me. I don't just mean that it's sexy to get consent, right? And that actually we should feel good about the idea that we're checking out and looking after one another. Consent and the seeking of consent, asking somebody, is it okay if I do this? Would you like me to do that? How about we try this? That's like hot. Sorry, I'm going to move along here. I've worn the worst shoes ever for running around the audience.
More specifically on the idea about the adult entertainment industry, there's only one sort of space where people are putting cameras in bedrooms, and it's not in your parents' bedroom. Anytime you film something, it becomes pornography. With that in mind, and that being the only lens in which we really see sex shown anywhere, other than someone wheeling out that awful television into the middle of the classroom, do you think, as an adult entertainer who's been taught, as you said earlier, in order to have and enjoy these scenes in a certain way that is safe, do you think there's more of a responsibility from the industry or from entertainers like yourself to provide that kind of education?
Wow.
Heavy.
There is, yes, in short, there is absolute responsibility on content creators to educate their viewers. Yes, we're there to sell content, we're there to allow people to experience fantasy, to explore their fantasies, and we have an absolute responsibility to represent sex in the most healthy way possible, that is appropriate to that is appropriate to society. And I don't think, there is a lot of bad press, obviously, about this, particularly around violence in porn against women, and I accept that happens. I think what I have found because we've taken away from studios and we've taken ownership of it as individuals through OnlyFans, Just for Fans, that we can show the real side of sex and show what is, I don't want to use the word appropriate, what is the best way forward.
There's something interesting as well, though, I think, and it's a shame almost that it didn't become a focus of the earlier discussion, because the way that we all navigate sex now, a lot of us, the fact that it's now done through digital environments, the sharing of photographs, sharing of content which actually in another day would have been considered pornographic content. There's something peculiar in the way that the role of that technology has changed our relationship to sex. In a way, we're kind of all porn stars now, right? And I know many of you have folders on your phones and things like that where you keep your content, which interestingly does have a strange legal dimension these days when you think about it, because you have to think about consent of who else's body is in those photographs. Have they given you consent to share those photographs and those videos with other people? There's something that's such a bigger discussion, particularly for queer people who have been doing this internet dating thing the longest, around how that's changed our relationship to sex and now the significance of the sexual act. And it's now been made public and transmissible in a completely new way, whereas if you were going down to the sauna or to the cottage and having sex with 50 people, would not have been seen. It's just, there's a strange data element to our sex lives now, isn't there?
Hi, my name's Peter Shannon, I'm part of the George X Trust. So just really more of a comment really rather than a question about harm reduction, what we mean by harm reduction. And I use the analogy when it comes to drugs and to sex of the motorbike. It's the most lethal way of getting from A to B. We don't ban it, we don't shame people who ride motorbikes or people who associate with motorcycling. We give them a helmet, we educate them, we give them brakes, we give them insurance, we educate, you know, and that's what we mean by harm reduction when it comes to drugs and sex, okay?
Oh, all right. It was like, there's a point. But there is a question over there from our dear sister. I round of applause for Sister Cheddar Gorgeous, please! You've been combating stigma and shame for how many decades now?
14 years since 1979.
Not you personally, though. No, you're younger than that.
No, I'm only 93.
You young thing.
Thank you very much. So my question, I just wanted to take it back a little to that question of the responsibility of educating kind of visually, because as a point Cheddar made was we don't sort of legislate against the representation of cigarette selling. You know, we might shift the visual depiction of it, but it is still legal. Sex practices very quickly get kind of closed down in terms of visual representation. And I would say there's a role here for the arts and for the wider kind of scheme of theatre, film, television, representation to engage in this question. So I think rather than putting it onto the adult content industry to say you should be educating, you should, you know, like only you, nobody else. My question is, how do we shift society generally in the general depiction of sex? Because I can't say the number of times I watch any old shit on telly on Netflix and there's a sex scene and I'm like, where's the discussion about condoms? Where's the discussion about, you know, boundaries? It's not sexy. I mean, we know consent is sexy, but the wider world of visual entertainment across the board does not engage. And in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of work done in smaller areas, community arts, community theatre, particularly in gay theatres and queer theatres and feminist theatres, trying to really shift the idea of representation. So in the 90s, you had people like Valerie Mason-John, who was part of the original London Pride, and she wrote plays where the whole question of consent was totally embedded in. But we don't do that now. The funding for those kind of things was always stopped short. I worked for 20 years in galleries trying to kind of work with negotiations of naked bodies and consent. The funding gets cut down, it's always classed as life drawing rather than kind of negotiations around nudity. And I think there's a wider sort of role here for not just us all having to put everything onto the sexual health industry and the adult entertainment industry, but asking those questions, where's the role in you know, the wider conversations across the board. And so, yeah, I don't know if you just want to comment on that. Sorry, it's been a long one.
It was good, and the real question, of course, is where was the discussion of douching in heated rivalry? Am I right? Sorry, please do contribute.
Yeah, I don't think it's fair to put it all on Zach to change the world. I think that's a little bit harsh. But it's more, I see it, you know, sort of like focus on the kids, and I think it's harsh, like it's got to be the teachers. Poor teachers have to do everything, don't they? But it has to be a wider society thing so that people feel confident enough to do what they want to do, but also not to do what they don't want to do, because there's just so many scripts that we all have to go down that is really constraining for all of us, you know, in whatever roles that we're doing, and we need to break out of that, and it certainly isn't the responsibility of the sex industry, I don't think. It's much wider.
I think I agree, second it. I think we need to be having open, honest conversations. We need to be using the arts, using theatre, using education, using health, all in combination to sort of stop being embarrassed about talking about sex. The majority of people engage in sex at some point. We're all sat here because of sex, and it's about cutting down that stigma, having open, honest conversations, and working together to communicate. So here.
Which leads me elegantly. Oh, do you want a question? You want a comment? All right, because that was going to be a really elegant leading into my final question.
Well, yeah, just on the back of that about theatre, because I'm 8 theatre, and I'm just going to do a little plug because my next show is exactly what you're talking about. So, well, I've not written it yet, so we'll see. But, so my next show is called A-Hole, and it's about my A-Hole. Yes, actually. But very much in that vein, trying to, the show's all about how do you reconnect with anal sex, particularly in my case, after sexual trauma, or how do you, as a child of the 80s and 90s, who lived through a lot of wider community trauma, how do you reconnect in a positive way with that and all the societal hang-ups around that. So just to say that, and there are other great people in my field as well doing amazing work around that as well, but the funding is really hard.
That's
really hard.
But that's the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, come to the opening of my A-hole.
So may say join that crowd. Do you want to tell people where they can find out information about that in the future? Do the plug properly.
NathanielJhall.co.uk. Fabulous.
So leading on to my elegant transition into the final closing question for you all, which is, it's very easy to say this is what we need to do, right? We need to be having more conversations around sex. We need to be talking about harm reduction. We need to do this. I'm going to ask you the hard question, which is if you had to give us a how do we break those scripts? How do we encourage those conversations? How do we lead to healthier relationships with sex? Is that thunder? I wasn't saying the walking, I meant the scraping of the chair. So how do we do that? How do we encourage that kind of conversation in sex? Immediate pass of It's tough.
Who can I pass it for? The thing that jumps out to me is having the conversations early on is probably really pivotal in this. We're all adults here. We've lived through a sort of a sex and shame generation, and I think for society to progress, we need to get to the grassroots and have the conversation with young people before they're sexually active, so that they're going in to sexual relationships, their exploration in a sex positive mindset. So my instinct is focus on younger people as one strategy to really move us forward as a society. There's a lot of hope and a lot of promise with the younger generation, but I think if we're not careful, we could be complacent and not be promoting healthy sexual relationships, boundary settings, consent. We really just need to focus on the youth. That's it,
I'm just reading a book at the moment about the late 1700s, and there's so much control put on people's lives through sex. And it was different mores at the time, but it's the same thing about control, isn't it? And so I think whatever we can do to empower people that they are in charge of their own bodies, but really in charge of their own bodies, not just, I'm going to do this because that's what I'm told to think I should be doing. Because I think that's half the problem, is that people do what they think they ought to be doing, rather than what they really want to do.
I think from my experience, it needs to start with us as individuals. I think we all need to look inward and deal with our shame and our embarrassment and our guilt about sex, and be freer in ourselves and uninhibited to have conversations with ourselves and our friends and the people that we meet.
And I didn't actually plan this, right? But what's dead funny is I think the way I would answer would be.
Get that synced in.
Right? Because actually, and I think it's something all of us can do, right? We can actually just start talking more. Like with the hookup, on Grindr, maybe actually we just start doing. I remember when I started doing this, so I did research about sex in, God, the research year was like 2010, and I was doing work around sex work and public sex. So stuff people didn't want to talk about. And it ruined my sex life. Because I had to confront how little I talked about sex and how little I had dealt with those things. And I didn't have sex for like, God, it was ages. It was like 3 weeks or something. It was a little bit longer than that. But I didn't have sex for a really long time. And you know, and I got quite depressed, and I had to work through that. And I had to build a language for dealing with sex that I just didn't have, because it was okay for me to just kind of stumble through these quite intimate encounters because it was what we were supposed to do and what you're expected to do, and what happened. And I think until we start challenging that and dealing with the really strange feelings we have in ourselves, I don't think we're going to move this forward around sex, regardless of where you fit on the boundaries or what's right or wrong or the morality of what we're talking about. But thank you so much to my wonderful panel. That's right.